He opened his eyes and saw only light, white, sterile, burning through the fog wrapped around his mind. A face hovered above him. Then another. Words he couldn't understand. A pressure in his skull that made it hard to breathe. The world pulsed in and out like a failing signal. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know how long he had been here. And in that moment, he couldn't remember who had put the bullets in his head. Outside the hospital room, officers moved in tight whispers. Their boots clicked on the polished floor. Their radios remained strangely quiet. A young man had survived something he shouldn't have survived, and now an entire department stood on the edge of a mistake so large, so irreversible, that it would echo for years. The official reports would try to wrap it in procedure. The media would try to wrap it in narrative. But the truth of what happened to Ryan Waller and what followed didn't fit neatly into anything. It broke the frame, it broke the system, and it broke the lives of everyone who touched it. The story began long before those bright hospital lights. It began 2 days earlier, on a quiet December evening in Phoenix, Arizona. A small rental house, faded blinds, a Christmas tree still standing in the corner. Inside was 21-year-old Ryan Waller, an easygoing, soft-spoken guy with a dry sense of humor, and a circle of friends who said he treated everyone with the same gentle calm. Beside him was his girlfriend, 18-year-old Heather Kwan, who filled every room with more brightness than any string of holiday lights. They were supposed to be wrapping gifts that night. Instead, the house would fall unnaturally still. Lights would remain on longer than they should. Neighbors would begin to wonder. Parents would call without getting answers. And out of those unanswered calls grew a slow, creeping worry that pushed Ryan's father, Don, toward a decision no parent wants to make: to dial the police and ask them to check on his child. When the officers arrived, they found the front door locked and the house unresponsive. They knocked, no answer. They circled the property. Still nothing. And instead of sensing danger, instead of imagining that the silence behind that door was the silence of violence, they made an assumption that would cost lives and leave one man wandering in the limbo between life and death. They assumed Ryan and Heather simply didn't want to come to the door. Protocol dictated a forced entry, a welfare check, a duty to ensure the safety of the people inside. But assumptions overrode protocol. The idea that a young couple just didn't want to be bothered replaced the possibility that someone inside urgently needed help. And so the officers left, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Hours passed, then a full day, then another, all while Heather remained lifeless on the floor, and Ryan lay beside her, slowly deteriorating, bleeding internally, drifting in and out of consciousness with 2 bullets lodged in his skull. By the time officers finally decided to force their way inside the home, the timeline of damage was already fixed. Heather was gone, Ryan was barely alive, and the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes wasn't the face of a paramedic or the comforting presence of someone asking if he was hurt. It was a gun drawn on him, a command to get on the ground, a demand for answers he was too injured to understand. The interrogation that followed, recorded on a police camera, would become one of the most haunting pieces of footage in modern true crime. A young man dazed, slurring, disoriented, unable to remember what had happened or where Heather was. Officers mistook his confusion for deceit. They mistook his injuries for attitude. And they pressed on him with questions as he bled in real time, repeating details he couldn't hold in his mind for more than a few seconds. Where's Heather? Who shot her? Why are there bullet holes? Why aren't you telling us the truth? Each question punctured him almost as sharply as the bullets had, and even as one side of his face drooped, even as his eyes swelled beyond recognition, even as he drifted mid-sentence and fell into the hollow pauses of brain trauma, no one in the room recognized what was happening to him. Not the detectives, not the patrol officers, not the supervisors who reviewed the footage later. And while that failure seemed small in the moment, a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding, it would become the cornerstone of one of the most devastating systemic failures in Arizona law enforcement history. What happened to Ryan wasn't just the work of one bad officer or one flawed moment. It was the slow accumulation of unchecked assumptions, procedural shortcuts, and a shocking lack of medical awareness that turned a young man's suffering into an administrative footnote. It was the pressure of holiday staffing, the culture of suspicion woven into every interview room, and the unspoken belief that if someone didn't behave like a victim, then perhaps they weren't one. Only after Ryan collapsed in the interrogation room, after paramedics finally examined him, after doctors rushed him into emergency surgery, did the truth become undeniable. He hadn't been hiding information. He hadn't been resisting. He hadn't been protecting a killer. He had been dying. Yet even then the consequences spiraled outward, because while Ryan lay in a hospital bed undergoing surgery that would remove large portions of his damaged brain, the real killers, two men with a personal connection to the couple, moved through the city unchecked. They weren't being hunted. They weren't being questioned. They had a full 2-day head start created not by cunning, but by systemic neglect. And at the center of it all was Heather's family, grieving not only the loss of their daughter, but the knowledge that the system designed to protect her had walked past her door. Twice. As the hours stretched into days, the truth of the crime would emerge, a forced entry, a targeted attack, and a motive rooted in bitterness and retaliation. But before any of that could unfold, one painful and necessary fact had to be confronted. None of this had to happen the way it did. Ryan didn't have to lie unconscious for nearly 2 days. Heather didn't have to wait for help that never came, and the killers didn't have to escape into the night unnoticed. Yet here they were, all consequences locked in place, all outcomes shaped by silence. The Ryan Waller case isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about the fragility of systems that depend too heavily on trust, assumption, and habit. It's about what happens when procedure bends under the weight of convenience, when instinct replaces protocol, and when a department fails to ask the most important question in any investigation: what if we're wrong? This is the beginning of that unraveling, the first thread pulled from a tightly woven tapestry of missteps, oversights, and avoidable tragedy. By the time the system realized the depth of the harm, the damage had already bled into the lives of 2 families, 2 communities, and one young man who would never again return to the person he was before those bullets tore through his skull. In the chapters ahead, we will walk step by step through each point of failure, each missed sign, each procedural deviation, and each human decision that compounded into catastrophe. But for now, we return to that room, the white lights, the blurred faces, the questions no one should ask a dying man. This is where it began. And this is only the beginning. They sat him in a small grey room built for confessions, not for compassion. A room where fluorescent lights hummed louder than the voices inside it, where the walls swallowed nuance and regurgitated only what detectives wanted to hear. Ryan Waller wasn't bleeding anymore. He was simply leaking slowly, silently, the way a dying machine cools down. His face was swollen, discolored, shifting into purples and deep reds that had no business appearing on someone who was still upright. And yet, he sat there breathing, trying to answer questions through a fog thick enough to drown in. The camera blinked to life at 6:03 p.m. Most viewers who would later discover this footage online would say the same thing. How was he even conscious? But consciousness is a spectrum, and Ryan existed in the dimmest corner of it, awake in body, absent in clarity, speaking words that sounded like they belonged to someone just returning from a faraway place. A 12-hour flight, a coma, somewhere between. Detective Dalton entered the room with a thin stack of papers under his arm, papers he believed held the beginnings of a homicide case, papers he was certain would lead to arguments, motive, timeline, resolution. What he didn't expect was a victim, injured, barely coherent, and somehow still handcuffed behind his back. The cuffs clinked gently each time Ryan shifted. He looked down at them, confused, as if someone had dressed him in another man's restraints. He wasn't resisting or panicking. He was trying to understand. That alone should have been the first alarm. Dalton cleared his throat, sat down across from him, and started the tape. This is where systemic failure stops being abstract and becomes visible. Frame by frame, minute by minute, a slow, preventable collapse of logic and duty. What people saw in that video wasn't just an interrogation, it was negligence unfolding in real time. Dalton leaned in. "Ryan, tell me what happened at the apartment." But Ryan didn't speak the way suspects speak. He spoke the way severely injured people speak, vague, disoriented, grasping at memories like fragments floating away from him. He blinked slowly, pupils uneven. Even the angle of his head was wrong, slightly slumped and drifting. A doctor would have seen the signs instantly. A paramedic too. But the only medical presence in that room was the body trying to keep him alive. Ryan started describing Christmas lights, the living room, something about going to sleep, something about waking up. His words drifted like he was underwater. Dalton misread confusion as deflection. He saw delay where there was brain trauma. He saw inconsistency where there was a fractured skull trying to form a sentence. But Ryan kept trying. He answered every question, even the ones that didn't make sense to him. He was polite, almost apologetic, as if he felt bad for not being able to give the detective the narrative he wanted. Meanwhile, miles away at a hospital, real suspects were treated with real medical care, while innocent victims sometimes died in waiting rooms. But here in this room the roles were reversed. The suspect was the one dying. Dalton pushed a sheet forward. "This is serious, Ryan. Someone's dead." The words landed heavy. Ryan blinked, processing nothing. His head swayed. He asked if he could go home. He asked where his girlfriend was. He asked if he was dreaming. He drifted, returned, drifted again. The detective's frustration grew, not loud, not aggressive, but insidious. He thought the dazed answers were strategy. He thought the slow blinking was playing dumb. He missed the eyes, the one detail no one with medical training would have ignored. One pupil was blown wide, the other shrinking and expanding slowly, unpredictably. The classic sign of a traumatic brain injury. The sign that time wasn't just running out. It was almost gone. Much later, when millions watched the footage, commenters said things like, "How did he not see it?" But that's the thing about systemic failure. It's not about individuals being blind. It's about systems training them to look for the wrong things. Detectives are trained to assume deception, not dying. Dalton pressed on. "Did you shoot her, Ryan?" That question now echoes as one of the most jarring moments in the entire case. Not because of the accusation, but because of Ryan's expression. He didn't react like someone offended. He reacted like someone who didn't understand the words. His mind was slipping. The investigation was slipping. Reality was slipping. At one point, he slowly explained that a man named Richie had come to the house, that there had been a break-in, that he had been shot. Dalton leaned back, unconvinced. To him, it felt too convenient, too improvised. But Ryan's version wasn't improvised. It was memory, fractured but real, bleeding out just like he was. The interrogation dragged on. Every minute mattered, and yet every minute was wasted. No ambulance, no evaluation, no intervention, just questions and answers that spiraled into confusion. On the other side of town, forensic teams were combing through the apartment. They found blood patterns inconsistent with a domestic fight. They found forced entry markers. They found signs of a struggle that didn't fit the theory of a spontaneous argument between lovers. The puzzle pieces were there. They just hadn't reached the people who needed them. Ryan's condition worsened. He asked if he could lie down. He asked for water. He asked for his dad. His voice cracked, not emotionally, but physically, like something inside was collapsing. Because it was. Finally, an officer outside the room noticed something wrong. He stepped in. "Detective, look at his face." Dalton turned, slow at first, then more sharply. It took that long for instinct to override assumption. He finally saw it. The swelling, the discoloration, the unequal pupils, the drifting consciousness. The interrogation ended. Paramedics were called. And as they lifted Ryan from the chair, his body slumped forward like a marionette with cut strings. He mumbled something. His words weren't recorded clearly. Some say he whispered his girlfriend's name. Some say he asked if he was in trouble. Others say he asked if he was going to die. What matters is that he was still alive when he left that room. He shouldn't have been there at all. He should have been in an ambulance hours earlier. He should have been treated, stabilized, protected, believed. But systemic failure doesn't ask what should happen. It only shows what does happen when assumptions override evidence and when haste replaces humanity. As the paramedics rushed him out, the detective watched silently, the weight of realization settling over him. They had interrogated a dying man. They had treated his symptoms as strategy, his confusion as guilt, his fading consciousness as evasion. And the truth, the real truth, had been sitting right in front of them the entire time. Collapsed in a chair, barely awake, trying to speak through the damage done to his body and the damage done by the system that failed him. The door closed behind the gurney, and the story of the Ryan Waller case shifted forever, from a domestic homicide investigation to one of the most haunting examples of procedural failure ever captured on camera. The sterile air of the emergency room was a stark contrast to the small, cold interrogation room. Here, every second was accounted for, every procedure precise, and every assumption discarded in favor of raw, undeniable medical fact. When Ryan Waller arrived, slumped and cyanotic, the shift was immediate and brutal. For the police department, he was a person of interest. In the hospital, he was a level 1 trauma, a cascade of failing systems demanding immediate, aggressive intervention. The doctors didn't need a police report to know what they were looking at. They had the physical evidence of catastrophic injury, the head wound, the severe edema, the Glasgow coma scale score so low it was a miracle he was still registering consciousness. The classic presentation of a traumatic brain injury, TBI, specifically an expanding hematoma and severe intracranial pressure, ICP. The bullets, 2 of them, were lodged deep within his brain tissue. One of the surgeons, Dr. Aris, a veteran of countless traumas, would later recall the police presence as being oddly intrusive. Detectives weren't supposed to be concerned with blood pressure and respiratory rate, but their whispers followed Ryan down the hall. They spoke not of the prognosis, but of the case. They were seeking evidence where the medical team was fighting for life. The CT scan delivered the verdict with chilling clarity. A large fragment of bullet had created a hemorrhage, and the brain was swelling against the unyielding confines of the skull. This wasn't a man recovering from a minor injury. This was a man whose condition had deteriorated minute by minute for nearly 48 hours. Every slur, every dazed blink, every confused answer captured on the police camera was not a sign of deceit, but a direct, real-time indicator of a brain compressed and dying. The only thing remarkable about his injuries, Dr. Aris would state, was that he was still talking. Every metric we looked at, the ICP, the pupil dilation, the massive internal bleeding, indicated he should have been in a coma or dead hours before. The simple fact that he survived the long ordeal in the house, the transport, and the relentless interrogation was a testament to his youth and physical resilience. But that resilience was now shattered. As Ryan was rushed into surgery for an emergency craniotomy, the gravity of the earlier procedural failure began to sink in for the police department. The system that had been so sure of its assumptions was now forced to confront the chilling timeline. The welfare check failure. 2 separate patrols dismissed the potential danger, assuming a minor inconvenience instead of investigating the locked door and unanswered calls. This was the initial sin of oversight and assumption. The time delay. The nearly 2-day gap between the first welfare check and the forced entry allowed Ryan's internal injuries to fester and Heather's chance of immediate aid to vanish. The time they didn't spend investigating was the time the killers used to escape. The interrogation, the most egregious failure. The officers and detectives ignored the overt, undeniable physical signs of severe head trauma, the unequal pupils, anisocoria, the facial droop, the slurred speech, and chose instead to pursue a faulty theory of domestic homicide. This was the failure of training and medical awareness. They were equipped to read body language for lying, but not for dying. The very evidence they had documented, the video of the interview, was now a permanent record of their own error. They had not just interviewed a victim, they had detained and accused a dying man. The act of handcuffing him, of sitting him upright in a chair while his brain was swelling, likely compounded his injuries. Every minute of that interrogation was effectively a moment of medical malpractice carried out by law enforcement. In the aftermath of Ryan's emergency surgery, the focus in the police administration immediately shifted to damage control. A team was assigned not only to track down the actual killers, the ones who had been gifted a massive head start, but also to review the disastrous timeline. The administrative inquiries would later try to isolate the blame. It was the patrol officers who left the scene. It was the detective who failed to recognize the trauma. It was a busy holiday week. But the truth lay not in individual incompetence, but in systemic culture. The culture of a police department often dictates an adherence to the initial narrative. Once the idea of a domestic incident took root, it became exponentially harder for officers to pivot to the reality of a home invasion. It required them to override their first judgment, admit error, and shift their entire operational structure. The procedural structure, built for certainty, had no quick response mechanism for admitting a mistake of this magnitude. Ryan Waller was now legally considered the sole survivor, the primary and most critical witness. Yet thanks to the system's failure, his testimony was locked behind an intensive care unit door, fractured by trauma, and only accessible through the complex, painful process of recovery and rehabilitation. The real killers were not only free, they were untainted by the initial police dragnet. The entire investigation was now 2 days behind, chasing ghosts, having spent the first 48 hours prosecuting the victim. The consequences of this systemic failure were no longer academic. They were human, they were neurological, and they were now a matter of life and death, both in the hospital and on the streets of Phoenix. Ryan Waller was fighting for his life, and the investigation was fighting to catch up to a truth it had actively ignored. Amidst the chaos and the urgent medical intervention for Ryan, the memory of Heather Kwan remained in the house, a painful, silent testament to the failure. Her family, reeling from the loss, were now forced to reckon with the horrifying knowledge that the police had been to her door and left. Their grief was complicated by anger, a righteous fury directed not just at the killers, but at the institution that had allowed their daughter to lie there. The police had focused on Ryan, his confusion, his status as a suspect, and in doing so had minimized the central tragedy of Heather's death. She was the one who could no longer speak, the one whose narrative the system had failed to protect from the beginning. The anatomy of systemic failure was now fully exposed. It wasn't just the death of a young woman, but the nearly fatal neglect of a young man, all compounded by a department that prioritized its flawed initial theory over the clear, physical evidence screaming for medical attention. The story was only just beginning to unfold, but the damage was already irreparable. Ryan's future and the department's reputation had been permanently altered in the space of that small, brightly lit interrogation room. What were the specific training protocols in place for TBI recognition for police detectives in Arizona at the time of the Ryan Waller case, and how did they compare to contemporary standards? The sirens had faded, replaced by the persistent, muffled beeps of the intensive care unit monitors. In the surgical waiting room, Detective Dalton sat with a lukewarm coffee, the sugar dissolving into a black mirror that reflected his own unease. His colleagues were busy working the scene, now properly classified as a homicide and a severe assault, a home invasion gone wrong. But Dalton was stuck in the quiet aftermath of the video footage he had just created. He had watched a victim almost die on his watch, and that realization was heavier than any case file. The doctors had been blunt. Ryan Waller had sustained massive, life-threatening injuries. The delay in getting medical treatment had been critical, dramatically increasing the risk of permanent neurological damage and death. The medical staff spoke in terms of mean arterial pressure and cerebral perfusion, language that sounded clinical but was fundamentally an indictment of police procedure. The officers who had reviewed Ryan's physical symptoms, the droop, the slurring, the disorientation, and deemed them evasiveness, had made an error that was no longer procedural, but ethical and potentially criminal. The review of the initial response began instantly, a frantic internal attempt to seal the cracks that were rapidly forming. The first welfare check, the officers who had left because they assumed the couple was simply ignoring them, was the point of origin for the failure. The officers argued they had seen no forced entry, no blood, and no signs of immediate distress, adhering to a minimum standard of no obvious danger before leaving. But the system was designed to default to safety, not to convenience. Why hadn't they attempted to reach the landlord? Why hadn't they tried the windows? Why was the path of least resistance chosen over the oath to serve and protect? Internal Affairs began pulling records. They found that training for recognizing severe trauma, especially closed head injuries that manifest as confusion, was woefully inadequate for patrol officers and only marginally better for detectives. They were trained to look for bleeding and broken bones, the visible wounds, not the subtle, insidious signs of brain swelling. The systemic flaw was revealed to be a curriculum gap, a blind spot where medical triage should have been taught. The department had invested in identifying deception, but neglected the fundamentals of identifying a medical crisis. Meanwhile, the investigation finally turned to the real perpetrators. Ryan's mumbled, fragmented memory of a man named Richie was now taken seriously. It was the only lead they had. Ryan had named his killer while functionally dying in an interrogation chair, and the detectives had dismissed it as a desperate lie. Now every resource was poured into finding this man, a suspect who had been allowed to walk free for 48 crucial hours. The forensic evidence from the house, previously set aside in favor of the domestic dispute theory, was now meticulously re-examined. Forced entry was confirmed. The pattern of the shell casings and the entry wounds on Heather Kwan pointed clearly to a robbery or targeted attack, not a struggle between intimates. The initial assumption that Ryan was the killer had poisoned the well, forcing the evidence to be interpreted through a biased lens. The true narrative was simple, clean, and terrifyingly violent. An invasion, an execution, and a miracle survival. The police chief faced the media with a carefully worded statement, acknowledging procedural shortcomings and promising a full, transparent internal review. But the public reaction was immediate and venomous. The footage of Ryan, swollen and incoherent, was a raw, visceral indictment of the department's failure. It wasn't just a mistake, it was an act of profound, documented inhumanity. The trust between the community and the police force had been fundamentally broken, all captured on a video lasting just over 30 minutes. Ryan Waller lay hooked to machines, his young life hanging by threads of surgical precision. He had 2 bullets removed, and a portion of his skull temporarily removed to allow the brain swelling to subside. His fight was now against a lifetime of recovery, against a profound, irreversible change to the very core of his identity. He survived the home invasion only to face the systemic failure, and the latter had done almost as much damage as the former. The next steps weren't just about catching the killers. They were about holding a flawed system accountable for nearly signing Ryan Waller's death certificate. The recovery room was not a place of peace, but of vigilant, fragile hope. Ryan Waller had survived the surgery, but the outcome was still measured in millimeters of swelling and slight, sometimes contradictory, neurological responses. He was in a medically induced coma, the last resort to keep his brain still and buy it time to heal from the catastrophic assault. His father, Don Waller, sat beside the bed, a man carved by worry. He had moved from the initial horror of finding his son's body to the profound, cold anger directed at the institution that had let him suffer. Don was now forced to communicate with the same department that had failed his son, relying on their competence to find the killers while simultaneously fighting for their accountability. This contradiction became the central, agonizing burden of his life. Behind the police department's closed doors, the promised full, transparent internal review was already fracturing. The senior command was attempting to define the failures as isolated incidents, a mistake by the patrol officers, an error in judgment by the detective. They wanted to contain the damage to a few individuals, to avoid the systemic conclusion. But the footage of the interrogation was an unerasable truth. The detectives who had interviewed Ryan now had to pivot from treating him as a suspect to relying on his fractured, trauma-compromised testimony to find the killers. This created an operational dilemma. How could they justify their initial suspicion while simultaneously presenting Ryan's confused recollection of Richie as the key, credible piece of evidence? The narrative shift was almost impossible to manage without admitting gross negligence. The actual investigation, however, was finally moving. Ryan's mention of Richie led them to Richie Carver, a name known in peripheral police files. Carver had a connection to the rental house and, crucially, to Heather Kwan's ex-boyfriend. This provided the motive they had been missing, Not a random robbery, but a targeted, bitter retaliation involving an accomplice, Jeffrey Lee. The system had initially discounted this complex real narrative for the simpler, easier-to-process theory of domestic violence. The delay caused by the procedural failure now manifested in physical distance. Carver and Lee, believing their victim was dead and the police were chasing a dead end, had 2 full days to create alibis, dispose of evidence, and relocate. When the police finally caught up, the trail of physical evidence, the guns, the bloody clothes, was already cold. Detectives eventually located Carver and Lee. The interviews were intense, focused, and precise, a stark contrast to the reckless interrogation of Ryan. The suspects' stories eventually crumbled under pressure, revealing the details of the home invasion, the intent to rob and intimidate, the escalation into violence, and the cold-blooded decision to leave the pair for dead. The most chilling revelation was the suspects' timeline. They admitted they watched the news and followed the minimal initial reports. They knew the police were circling, but they also knew they were safe because the police were focusing on the wrong man. The killers had been handed a 2-day immunity window, a gift provided directly by the systemic blind spots of the law enforcement agency. With the killers finally in custody, the media attention intensified, but the focus remained dual: the capture of the suspects and the accountability for the failures. The department had solved the crime, but at the cost of its reputation and the life-altering injury of its key witness. The official internal review concluded that the detective and the patrol officers involved in the initial checks should face disciplinary action, ranging from suspensions to mandatory retraining. But for the public, this was insufficient. The failure wasn't just a matter of a few bad decisions. It was a deep, corrosive issue with training, culture, and the assumption of guilt when confusion presented itself. As Ryan began the excruciating years-long journey of rehabilitation, learning to walk, to speak, and to process memory all over again, the criminal case against Carver and Lee moved forward. But the legacy of the Ryan Waller case had already been established. It was the textbook example of how a failure to recognize medical reality can irrevocably derail a police investigation and compound the tragedy of violent crime. The justice for Heather and the recovery of Ryan would forever be tainted by the knowledge that the system designed to protect them had nearly killed the survivor. The hospital room transformed into the epicenter of a new, complex battleground: the fight for recovery and the fight for justice. Ryan Waller was slowly pulled out of the coma, a process marked not by celebration, but by profound uncertainty. The medical reports were brutal. His injuries were life-changing. He suffered from severe anomia, the inability to name objects, difficulties with short-term memory retrieval, and pronounced physical deficits on his left side. The Ryan Waller who went into that house on a December evening was gone. The person who woke up was a survivor navigating a world shattered by violence and systemic failure. With the killers, Richie Carver and Jeffrey Lee, in custody, the prosecution's case moved forward. Ryan was their star witness, the only one alive who could place the suspects at the scene of the murder and assault. However, the prosecution faced a major obstacle created entirely by the police department's initial errors. Ryan's testimony was vulnerable. Defense attorneys for Carver and Lee immediately seized upon the interrogation footage. They argued that the police had coerced the initial fragmented confession out of a mortally wounded man, undermining the credibility of everything Ryan might say in court. More powerfully, they argued that the police's failure to recognize and treat the traumatic brain injury had corrupted the evidence. How could the jury trust the memory of a man whose brain, according to the state's own doctors, was actively swelling and dying when he gave his initial statements? The defense's strategy was to shift the focus from the brutality of the home invasion to the negligence of the state, turning the trial into a referendum on the Phoenix Police Department. The system was now being forced to prosecute 2 murderers while simultaneously defending its own failure to protect the victim. In the backdrop of the impending trial, the Phoenix Police Department was engulfed in an internal crisis. The public outrage over the interrogation video led to swift mandatory policy changes. The systemic failure demanded systemic correction. New protocols were established, requiring any person detained or questioned who exhibited signs of confusion, slurred speech, or visible head trauma to receive a mandatory, documented medical evaluation before any interrogation could begin. All patrol officers and detectives were required to undergo extensive, recurring training, specifically focused on recognizing the signs of traumatic brain injury, acknowledging that brain trauma often mimics intoxication or deception. The vague no obvious danger standard was replaced with a more rigorous protocol for forced entry during welfare checks, requiring supervisors to justify not entering a residence if contact cannot be established, especially following concern from a family member. These changes were an implicit admission of guilt. The reforms were necessary, but they came tragically late for Heather Kwan and for Ryan Waller. They were monuments to the fact that the system had required a young man to nearly die on camera to correct its own fundamental flaws. Don Waller's attention was split between his son's daily, painful rehabilitation and his demand for accountability from the department. He didn't just want the killers convicted, he wanted the officers and command staff who allowed the failure to be held responsible. His efforts led to a civil rights lawsuit against the city of Phoenix and the police department, alleging that the officers' actions, the abandonment during the welfare checks, and the negligent interrogation constituted a violation of Ryan's constitutional rights. This legal battle ran parallel to the criminal trial, ensuring that the system's failings would not be confined to an internal footnote, but would be scrutinized in the public forum of a courtroom. The civil lawsuit was the final, devastating chapter of the systemic failure. It forced the department to pay not just with disciplinary actions, but with financial restitution to cover the massive, lifelong medical expenses resulting from the delay in care. The cost of the systemic neglect was now calculated in millions of dollars and a young man's lost future. The system was finally paying its bill, but the price of that education had already been paid by Ryan and his family. The civil lawsuit filed by Don Waller against the city of Phoenix and the police department became the public arena where the systemic failures were dissected piece by piece. This wasn't a criminal case seeking to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a civil action seeking to establish negligence and liability by a preponderance of the evidence. The central arguments revolved around the constitutional doctrine of deliberate indifference, a claim that the police actions or inactions were so flawed they amounted to a willful disregard for Ryan's life and safety. The plaintiff's legal team meticulously presented the timeline of failures. They showed the jury the 2 discarded welfare checks, arguing that the officer's choice to leave was not merely a mistake, but a violation of the fundamental duty to protect. They then introduced the interrogation video, which served as the most powerful piece of evidence. A medical expert testified for the plaintiff, explaining that the time Ryan spent detained and upright, suffering from uncontrolled intracranial pressure, exacerbated his brain injury and directly contributed to the severity of his permanent deficits. This testimony transformed the police misconduct from an administrative error into a direct cause of physical harm. The defense for the city of Phoenix countered by arguing that the officers were acting within the scope of their training and procedure at the time, and that the ultimate cause of Ryan's injuries was the criminal actions of Richie Carver and Jeffrey Lee, not the subsequent police response. They attempted to humanize the patrol officers, presenting them as overworked individuals making judgment calls under pressure, but the video evidence of the detective questioning a visibly dying man was nearly impossible to defend. The civil trial thus shone a harsh, unforgiving light on the culture of suspicion that permeated the department, revealing a prioritization of quick closure over patient investigation and medical protocol. Meanwhile, in the separate criminal proceedings, the state pressed forward with the murder and assault charges against Carver and Lee. The defense attorneys continued to challenge Ryan's ability to testify. Ryan, having endured months of intense physical and cognitive therapy, was eventually deemed competent to appear. His testimony was halting, marked by the language difficulties and memory gaps caused by the TBI, yet it was undeniably powerful. He provided the crucial identification, placing the 2 men inside the house. His courage in testifying, despite his profound injuries, stood in stark contrast to the initial bureaucratic indifference he had faced. The criminal trial was a tense, emotional affair. The jury heard from forensic experts who confirmed the home invasion narrative, contradicting the initial police theory. They also viewed the police interrogation tape, though it was presented by the defense as evidence of compromised police work, rather than by the prosecution. Ultimately, the overwhelming physical evidence, coupled with Ryan's harrowing testimony, secured the convictions. Richie Carver and Jeffrey Lee were found guilty of murder and attempted murder, finally providing justice for Heather Kwan and locking away the individuals directly responsible for the violence. The conviction, however, did not erase the systemic failures. The civil case was still pending, and its outcome would determine the lasting institutional consequence of the Ryan Waller case. The prosecution of the killers had addressed the criminal violation, but the civil lawsuit was intended to address the governmental violation, ensuring that the department would pay a financial and procedural penalty for prioritizing assumption over humanity. The two trials, running on parallel tracks, formed a complete picture of the tragedy. A crime of violence followed by a crime of institutional neglect. The culmination of the civil rights lawsuit arrived years after the criminal conviction, but its verdict sent a more seismic shockwave through the Phoenix Police Department. The jury heard the final arguments detailing how the system's actions directly aggravated Ryan's injuries. The central theme was the violation of his 14th Amendment rights, specifically the right to substantive due process, arguing that when the state takes a person into custody, as they did by detaining and interrogating Ryan, they incur a duty to provide for that person's basic needs, including medical care. By denying him care and treating his medical crisis as a strategy of evasion, the police were deemed to have acted with deliberate indifference. The verdict was a decisive victory for the Waller family and a profound defeat for the city of Phoenix. The jury awarded the Wallers a substantial financial settlement, millions of dollars intended not as a punishment for the officer who pulled the trigger, who was already in prison, but as a penalty for the institution that failed to recognize its victim. This massive judgment was a concrete fiscal acknowledgement of the systemic negligence, forcing the city to recognize the true cost of their procedural shortcuts. The financial penalty was only one layer of the consequence. The civil trial forced the police department to make public testimony under oath about its training deficiencies, its culture of suspicion, and its supervisory failures. This public exposure led to an unprecedented level of scrutiny from the city council and community oversight groups. The department was compelled to implement the procedural changes they had already drafted, the mandatory TBI screening, the refined welfare check protocols. But now those changes were under public and legal oversight, ensuring they would be strictly enforced and continually updated. Meanwhile, Ryan Waller's rehabilitation continued, a slow, grueling process measured in small victories and frequent setbacks. He faced a lifetime of medical needs, cognitive therapy, and the psychological burden of being the face of institutional failure. He regained much of his mobility and could communicate, but the processing speed and memory functions that govern daily life remained severely compromised. His life, and his father's, became a permanent dedication to navigating the complex disability support systems, all while watching the wheels of institutional change turn glacially slow. The Ryan Waller case became a mandatory part of police training academies, not just in Arizona, but nationwide. It was used as the definitive case study on how to recognize and avoid tunnel vision in an investigation, and more importantly, how to prioritize the sanctity of life and medical necessity over the expediency of an interrogation. The interrogation video, once a piece of internal police documentation, transformed into a powerful cautionary educational tool, ensuring that Ryan's suffering had a lasting, tangible impact on police procedure for future generations of law enforcement officers. His survival became the catalyst for a fundamental re-evaluation of how law enforcement treats individuals suffering from critical trauma. The years following the criminal convictions and the civil settlement brought a degree of closure, but not peace. Ryan Waller continued his rigorous, lifelong rehabilitation. His father, Don, became an accidental, reluctant activist, channeling his pain and frustration into ensuring that the failures that nearly cost Ryan his life would not be repeated. The Waller family was forever altered, bound together by the shared trauma of the assault and the subsequent fight against the system. Their life was now defined by doctor appointments, therapy sessions, and the constant navigation of a world that was no longer simple or forgiving. The financial settlement, while substantial, was quickly earmarked for Ryan's extensive ongoing medical care, which included speech therapy, occupational therapy, and neurological consultations. It covered the cost of a future he was never supposed to have, one where he required constant assistance and adaptation. The money served as a grim symbol of the systemic error, a young man's life traded for a massive payout that could never truly restore what was lost. The enduring impact of the case resonated most profoundly within the halls of the Phoenix Police Department. The mandatory TBI training and the revised welfare check protocols were deeply embedded, but the culture shift required much longer. Supervisors and veteran detectives, forced to watch the interrogation tape as part of their annual review, had to grapple with their past assumptions. The case became a constant, unspoken reminder in every interrogation room. Are we sure this person is not injured? The fear of repeating the public humiliation and the financial penalty of the Waller case acted as a powerful deterrent against procedural sloppiness. The case also sparked a wider national conversation about the intersection of law enforcement and mental health or trauma. Defense lawyers across the country began using the Waller precedent to challenge confessions obtained from individuals who were physically or cognitively compromised, leading to greater judicial scrutiny of interrogation methods. The simple video recording of Ryan's suffering forced courts to look beyond the surface of a signed confession and into the medical capacity of the person giving it. Yet, despite the victories and the widespread procedural changes, the true measure of systemic failure remained etched on Ryan's face and in his halting speech. The justice of the convictions and the settlement were external correctives. They couldn't fix the damage done to the human core. The chapters of the tragedy were closed for the courts, but for the Waller family, the story was still being written, one difficult step and one remembered word at a time. The legacy of the Ryan Waller case became one not of perfect justice, but of necessary, painful change born from catastrophic neglect. The Ryan Waller case stands as a permanent, painful artifact in the landscape of American law enforcement, a lesson etched not in policy manuals, but in the raw video footage of a dying man's confusion. The official records of the city of Phoenix carry the indelible mark of the massive civil judgment, a constant reminder of the fiscal penalty for institutional neglect. This financial burden ensures that the mandatory training, the TBI recognition protocols, the stricter welfare check standards cannot be easily discarded or defunded. The case permanently altered the risk assessment matrix for police departments across the country. The price of an improper interrogation became infinitely higher than the price of patient procedure. Beyond the financial and procedural changes, the case forced a difficult cultural reckoning. The old maxim of policing, assume the worst and work backward, was confronted by a new ethical imperative. Assume the possibility of unseen injury or cognitive impairment and prioritize life. The interrogation room, once a psychological weapon, was now mandated to be a venue for initial triage and medical observation. The presence of a camera, initially meant to protect the police against claims of brutality, became the tool that exposed their indifference, ensuring that transparency served as the ultimate guardian of accountability. Ryan Waller, the quiet, soft-spoken young man, survived 2 assaults, the bullets that pierced his skull and the system that failed to believe he was hurt. His continued life, marked by the daily struggle of rehabilitation, became the most powerful, enduring evidence of both. He was the catalyst for change, the face of the consequences when bureaucracy overrides basic humanity. His story, repeated in training academies and public discourse, ensures that the initial failures, the casual dismissal of a worried parent, the dismissal of severe trauma as evasion, will always be remembered not as isolated mistakes, but as the avoidable catastrophic convergence of systemic flaws. The story of Ryan Waller is not just a true crime narrative, it is a clinical dissection of what happens when the very institutions designed to protect us break down, and how a survivor's pain can ultimately compel the necessary, agonizing process of reform. So tonight, as you turn off the lights and lock your door, think about this. How many stories remain untold, waiting beneath the surface of silence? How many forgotten names still linger in unmarked graves, hoping to be spoken again? I'll leave you with that question. This is Mythos and Murder Manor. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you have theories, thoughts, or other cases you'd like me to investigate, share them in the comments. And remember, monsters don't live under your bed. Sometimes they live right next door.